Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to the CANIE COP26 Climate Action Week Summit Session number 2. It has been a wonderful week already, and absolutely, to me, invigorating to see and meet colleagues from around the world, just sharing a passion for climate action and uniting together and to learn more from one another and strengthen our network. We really want to thank you for your enthusiasm and your support in attending CANIE events. Whether this is your very first time joining us or you're practically a regular now, we really appreciate you choosing to spend part of your day or your night with us. My name is Ine Williams, and I'm one of the CANIE Global Board members. I joined the board in August of 2020, and I'm zooming in today from the state of Arizona in the United States. I live in Maricopa, Arizona, which is south of Phoenix and north of Tucson, Arizona, if you're familiar with the area. So I'd like to take a moment to pay my respects and gracefully acknowledge the Akimel O'odham peoples whose ancestral and traditional homelands I stand, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who have continued to live here or have made their home here today. Seeing as we're in a virtual environment, I'd also like to extend my respects to the traditional owners and custodians of lands from wherever our participants are gathered today. Before we get started with the program, I want to give some Zoom housekeeping basics, even though I know probably everyone now knows all of these things. First of all, we are in a Zoom meeting. We are not in a webinar. So that's really important to know because it means you have the power to do things with your mic. And I'd like to request that you keep your mics on mute during the presentation, just so we can avoid background noise and also mic feedback. Definitely, we'd love for you to engage with us, and we have the chat function available to do that. So please add your comments, your questions. If you have links that you'd like to share with us, do that. Just remember that in the chat, there's 2 settings. There's one that everyone can see and one that is for individuals. So please make sure, put it to everyone if you'd like us all to see what you're sharing. We do also have 2 dedicated CANIE Europe members joining us today to support the chat, Margarita and James, as well as Diego on lead tech and Adrian as our slide guru. And then we have our presenters coming in later, and I'll introduce them at that point. So doing this as a team, it really makes everything better. So now, for any reason you drop off of this Zoom session and you just lose track of us, I just want to remind you that the link that you use, that can be used to pop back in, and you'll just be able to continue along with the rest of the presentation. We will have, like I mentioned earlier, a networking event at the end. And the reason that we're doing this is because we heard a lot of feedback from previous events that people would like to have some time to connect to one another after the events for discussion, networking, and to navigate questions in more intimate groups. So your wish is our command. Please join us at the end of today's event for an opportunity to network in small groups. So we'll also share some feedback opportunities at that point. So we'll give you a link to a survey, and that will be a really important way for us to continue to improve. Finally, a last couple of things I want to tell you before we get started with a little bit more is ways to stay connected. So speaking of networking, if you want to stay connected to CANIE, you'll have plenty of opportunities to do so. We're available on all of the major social media platforms. You can also sign up with CANIE on our website if you'd like to find out more of what we're doing and what we'll be up to next. We'll be sure to share that link with you towards the end and throughout the day. If you ask for it, we're happy to add it to the chat. And we'll share it with you also, of course, at the end of the program when we send updates. So with that, I'd like to make sure you know a little bit about CANIE before we present our feature program. So CANIE started about 2 years ago when a group of professionals, individuals got together in the industry and saw this need and opportunity to do something more collective as an industry. So yes, you can work on climate impact individually, but it's a lot more powerful when you come together. And there was all this great work happening, a lot of movement within the higher education spaces, especially around sustainability, climate change. People were doing a lot of research. They were infusing climate into their curriculum and teaching. They were updating campus infrastructure, all these things to be more sustainable, but there was still this gap that existed where they weren't addressing international students, globally mobile students, or transnational students. Those were categories that just were not part of the conversation at the time, and definitely not the emissions of the student mobility and the sector infrastructure, all the services and supply chains, for example, all of the pieces behind the scenes. Those were not being taken into account. So starting CANIE was really a means to start to highlight those gaps, try to work to raise the collective ambition of the sector and be more bold so that we could really start to put environmental sustainability at the kind of forefront, at the heart of everything that we do. And given the reach that we've had globally over the course of our 2-year existence, we've now had over 750 institutions connecting with CANIE through some means, events, podcasts, through our social media. It just seems like this is becoming very important to a lot of people, and we're really happy to see that. It just expands our network and the people that we can talk to and work these solutions out together. And in concert with information like the most recent IPCC report, we're really primed to gain some real momentum in our sector as we bring people together to share expertise and accelerate and catalyze action. So let's actually connect our beginning to where we are today by briefly taking a look at an overview of this week of CANIE's climate action. So earlier this week, we started out with climate justice to help anchor and center climate justice in our thoughts and our actions throughout the week, plus to challenge people to use their climate justice centered perspective during International Education Week, which is coming up next week. So we'll end this entire week with regional meetings and provide updates for our first ever leadership forum events. And that's where we brought representatives from organizations and institutions of higher education together to share ideas and build commitments. So I'm encouraging you to attend one of the regional meetings this week if you can, or join a chapter and get involved. This is going to be a great time to start to see a lot more movement in our sector. Before we dive into what we're going to see today, I want to make sure you know what to expect. The objective for today is to learn more about climate anxiety among practitioners. And we're actually going to have an encore presentation of session 1, where we had 3 different folks come and join us. That's going to be the first part, along with the Q&A. Then we're going to get some practical, actionable steps to start making changes today. And then we're going to meet like-minded practitioners like yourself and share key takeaways. So to just further set the scene, the first half is going to be the encore, and that's going to be Anne and Maya and T. And then we're going to shift it over to Elsa Lamont, and she's going to present on getting started. How do you kind of get your foot in the door with this process? And there's going to be a panel that's going to be moderated afterwards with 3 colleagues who are here in the audience today: Chris Haynes, Daniel Ponce-Taylor, and Dr. Utio Raichaudhuri. And then finally, we're going to take everything we've absorbed into smaller spaces via breakout rooms and network and discuss with attendees and panelists. So just stick around at the end and you'll get a chance to talk to everyone. All right, so at this point, we have a video of session 1, the encore presentation with Anne Campbell, T. Nguyen, and Maya Stewart of Middlebury Institute of the International Studies. And they're going to discuss the evolution of their research on climate anxiety and eco-paralysis. Their qualitative study explores practitioner perceptions of the climate impacts of student mobility and offers insights into making changes at institutions with competing priorities. So enjoy.
Hello. My name is Dr. Anne Campbell, and I'm speaking on behalf of our team, which includes T. Nguyen and Maya Stewart. And we're here from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California, to talk with you about our presentation titled Going Global versus Going Green, Practitioners, Perceptions, and Concerns. This is based on a research project that we started in 2020 to respond to the growing concern from students, alumni, staff, and faculty about the role that international education plays in climate change. Increasingly, we were worried about the business as usual approach to international mobility for education purposes. And we understand that international travel by plane contributes a great deal of carbon to the atmosphere. Yet at the same time, we truly value the transformational experience of international education that each of us has benefited from. And we are committed to expanding this transformational education more broadly to diverse populations and generations of future students worldwide. So we felt stuck, wanting to promote international mobility while decreasing carbon emissions. At the same time, climate change became a topic in many of our classes and in my office hours. Students were asking me how I was personally responding to these topics. So thanks to the Middlebury Institute, we were able to receive funding to support this research and take it further. And last year, T and I designed a qualitative research study to better understand the ways that international education professionals respond to climate change. We were interested in their opinions, feelings, and actions, both those they take professionally and those that they take personally. We also wanted to know about their aspirations for the future of the field. We put out a call for interviewees and spoke with 17 individuals who are either early career or mid-career international education professionals. Maya Stewart joined our team this year, and all three of us are here to present today. Individuals in this study participated in interviews ranging from 60 to 90 minutes during the summer and fall of 2020. And we're very grateful to our interviewees to speak with us during one global crisis, which was the COVID-19 pandemic, about another, which is the crisis of climate change. This exploratory qualitative study was designed to answer two research questions, which are here on the screen. First, how do international education professionals perceive the relationship between international student mobility and global warming? And then second, what additional information do international education professionals need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? For today's talk, we will focus on certain findings from the study that are relevant to the theme of this CANIE Summit. That is climate anxiety among professionals and climate action. Maya and T will each present one set of findings. And then after this, we're each going to share a takeaway message from our work together. Like you, we have been thinking deeply about the intersection of international education and climate change. And this has raised some important issues, questions, and recommendations for a way forward. And we'd like to share those with you today. And now I'll turn it over to Maya.
Thanks, Anne. So from our research, we found that the majority of practitioners in the study reported some level of climate anxiety. Before we proceed, we want to define climate anxiety. It is a chronic emotional distress induced by global warming related events that stems from the growing awareness of direct and indirect environmental impacts on individual lives. These definitions have been shaped by many scholars, but we would like to acknowledge Blanche Verley at the University of Sydney and Sarah Jacquette Ray at Humboldt State University here in California for their contributions to our thinking. Participants' anxiety stem from a desire to do more for the planet, lack of conversations with colleagues, and a lack of environmental knowledge or efforts within offices that don't seem to make much of an impact, or the impact is unknown. For example, recycling paper. If there are conversations, the solutions presented are unattainable. For example, buying an electric car. Next slide, please. To expand on the lack of conversations, some conversations about global warming and international education aren't held because it could be seen as negative. One participant stated that discussing the topic of going green felt like a threat to the field, especially considering international educators already have to justify why their field is important and the challenges faced during the COVID pandemic. This workplace experience contrasts with the activity in participants' personal lives, where they have tried to make environmentally conscious decisions around food and transportation. Some participants spoke about transitioning to vegetarianism and limiting the amount of plastic they use. Our interviewees also talked about how their education abroad experience taught them about different ways to be environmentally responsible, and they still use these practices today. Despite their efforts, there seemed to be a disjointed narrative. This disconnect between the lack of support regarding environmentally conscious decisions in their professional lives versus the consistent decisions made in their personal lives could be defined as career-related imposter syndrome. This feeling implied that they weren't able to fully express or enact their values, questions, and concerns to their work in international education. Now I will pass it to T to discuss the tension between actions and aspirations of practitioners.
Thank you so much, Maya, for providing an overview of climate anxiety and career-related imposter syndrome in our community of international education practitioners. I can definitely relate to some of the participants' frustrations and confusion at a personal level. And to supplement Maya's points, I'm going to present our second set of findings, which highlights significant gaps between current actions and aspirations of practitioners in responding to climate change, mainly at the organizational level. So one thing I'd like to highlight here is that despite the tension directed toward carbon emissions generated by plane travel, there were very few who said that international education might need to get rid of mobility altogether or ask students to pay for carbon offsets. Some participants even noted that this would penalize students and fail to address the main polluters, such as the big corporations. And instead, what we saw happening during the interviews was our participants had the will to make decisions focused on the environment. Notably, many of them expressed desire to expand international education as a tool to facilitate environmental justice and global citizenship. Examples of using international education to advance environmental awareness mostly included green education abroad programs which aim to raise awareness of sustainability in recruitment materials. For example, the marketing of eco-friendly habits in host countries, and those which incorporated environmental knowledge as a learning outcome. For example, the learning about climate refugees in Peru. And through these programs, students were able to adopt and educate others upon returning home on the culture of environmental responsibility in countries like Japan, France, and Switzerland. Some also became more conscious of how the Western consumption culture could affect the most vulnerable groups around the world, such as indigenous, minority, and low-income people, as well as how climate impact would always fall disproportionately on these communities. Next slide, please. And while these aspirations were legitimate, traditional priorities of international education programs, such as managing budget and time, growing enrollment and program variety, maximizing student learning, and responding to the demands from partners, prevented practitioners from engaging productively and consistently with sustainability goals. More specifically, some participants in our study were frustrated that supervisors and organizational leaders were not doing more to overcome the day-to-day business as usual practices, step out their comfort zones, and push for a more permanent change. They will also express concerns about sustainability practices, such as charging a carbon offset fee or having students volunteer to plant trees in the host country, calling them greenwashing. Our participants call them greenwashing. And they said that these practices had allowed organizations to create a false impression of commitment to sustainability while ignoring their role in contributing to climate change, exacerbating inequity in access to international education for students, and perpetuating harmful aspects of volunteer tourism. And another intriguing point that a few interviewees brought up was that even though climate issues were emerging as an important topic in international education, other pressing global concerns, such as responding to the impact of COVID-19 and racial tensions around the world, had recently received greater attention, which further overshadows environmental needs. Interestingly, instead of seeing these issues as all part of an interconnected challenge for the field of international education, participants reported these as separate challenges that demanded additional time and resources during a very difficult time for the field of international education. I'm going to pass it back to Anne.
Thank you, T. And thank you, Maya, as well. So where we are now is we want to each leave you with one takeaway message, and we'll each take a turn. And I get to go first. So I'd like to highlight the point that professionals are asking for action. So from our research, we can say that the challenge is not whether practitioners are asking for leadership, information, and guidance on climate change and climate action. They're ready for action. It's time for us to look more deeply at the language, approach, and solutions that we recommend as a field. Without these, it leads to a feeling of eco paralysis or eco anxiety, And as one interviewee noted, it gives a feeling of an icky ethical feeling about the fields of international education. What we need are clear plans, platforms, programs, and methods within the fields of international education that truly reduce carbon while also promote intercultural learning and international education. And kudos to CANIE for this summit, which is pointed in that direction. And now I'll pass it to Maya.
Thank you. So in addition to change, practitioners must recognize that climate action is social justice work. Climate change negatively impacts everyone, but severely impacts people of color and those who are most vulnerable worldwide. It's unfair to keep imposing our unsustainable consumer practices in other countries. We must create sustainable programs that won't become a burden to the local host countries and communities or those that have a negative impact on their environment. As one step forward, we must teach students to calculate and mitigate their carbon footprint, especially in new environments as much as possible. This can be done in program materials, during the pre-departure process, during the program, and once students return home. It is important now more than ever. And I'll pass it to T.
And last but not least, there is, of course, an urgent need for international education as a field to orient policies and practices more toward environmental interests. From our conversations with practitioners, sustainability should be a mandatory aspect of mobility program design and of the intercultural curriculum. We should also put hope in returnees of green education abroad programs, since these students could pay it forward by sharing their transformative environmental learning experiences and generating impact at home, be it through campus engagement activities or leadership roles in their communities. And let's never forget, the responsibility doesn't lie on us alone. Collaborations across all disciplines and industries are paramount to combating climate change, and international education practitioners play a key role in catalyzing such collaborations, given our significant contribution to and frequent interaction with tourism, business, diplomacy, informational technology, social good, and many other sectors. And no matter which stage we are in our careers or where we're coming from, we all share a mutual responsibility in building a more altruistic, just, and sustainable world. And this is why we need to take a pro-climate stance in our work, support one another, and most importantly, guide generations of internationally mobile students to be change agents in the era of global warming. And this brings us to the end of our presentations. Our contact information is on the screen. Feel free to get in touch in the future if you have any questions or would like to have a more in-depth conversation with all of us. Thank you so much for listening and have a great time at the summit.
Great. So as you can see, we are joined by Dr. Anne Campbell and Maya Stewart. How are you ladies doing? How are you doing?
Yeah, pretty good. It's nice to see you all.
Same, doing pretty well. Happy to be here.
I am very happy that you are here. And I'm really excited to get into this discussion. If you haven't, people who are joining us, if you haven't already, you might, Maya and Anne and T joined us on a podcast. It was the first episode of season 2. So you'll hear me referring to the podcast. If you haven't checked it out, 10/10 recommend. It was a great way to kick off season 2 because this work is really about you and about practitioners. And so I'm keen to dig in with more questions since we last spoke. And if you have questions, and I see some are coming up in the chat, and that's really great. So Anne, you mentioned in the presentation that people, were proactively asking you about this, whether it was your colleagues and students. And I love that your research was about getting into people's feelings. And I think that everyone is here today because they have a feeling that they want to take action. So how do you hope that this new research, is used in the sector and by practitioners.
Yeah, thanks, CJ. And I also send greetings on behalf of Tina Wen. She's sorry, she can't be here today. So it's a really good question of how this research might actually be used. And I think that's, at least for me, that's an essential part of all research, that it actually has some impact on change and social change. And for us, we're really, first and foremost, wanted to explore this notion of an elephant in the room, so to speak, and if it was something that we needed to explore more and understand. But as you noted, it did come from a lot of tough questions that were asked of me as a faculty member and as a former administrator of international education, of how I was reacting and how I was sleeping at night and how I was going about dealing with all of this. And at the time, it was quite surprising to me that there was very little around the emotion of responding to climate. Although many of us live in parts of the world where it's happening daily, that we see climate change outside of our windows. But for me, it was not, it took a long time to understand kind of the conversation around climate anxiety and eco-paralysis. And it's increased over time quite a bit. So that's actually quite impressive. When we started this work a little over a year ago, there was almost nothing, and now it's quite common. But I do think that it has taken a while to think about what we're talking about, what students are talking about, how to go about reconciling being so committed to international education, and at the same time realizing that it is also contributing to carbon outlay and the lifestyles. So it was very much student motivated and kind of self-reflected.
Great, thank you for that. And Maya, I did want to ask you a question. One of the findings that T mentioned in her presentation was about the frustrations that practitioners are feeling and that your interviewees or feeling, or challenges that they're facing in needing to know how to deal with climate action, in addition to sort of the racial justice issues. And you mentioned in your closing that climate action work is social justice work. And I'm hoping that you can expand on what that means for our practitioners here today, and what actions they can take as a result of that real truth, but in that perspective.
Yeah, so like I said in the presentation, and like T had spoken about as well, that the hardest hit populations are those who are underrepresented, underserved, and typically people of color. So I'll speak from more of a study abroad, education abroad focus, since that's what I'm more comfortable speaking about. But I think from the practitioner standpoint, I think it's really important to look at the whole program. What kind of activities are students going to be doing that relies on transportation, push back on something that you think might not be a very environmentally friendly or environmentally conscious way to do this activity, for example. I think when talking to students, ask students about I guess this is more of a reflective or emotional side, but a benefit cost analysis. What's your impact going to be when you go there versus what you're actually going to get from the program? Because it might not require a student to actually travel to have those experiences. Not saying that travel isn't important, but at the same time, we're now in a climate crisis, so we have to think about how we're going to do things differently.
Yeah, and that's the challenge, is how to do things differently. And in the context of the climate justice piece, if you haven't, I see some faces from yesterday's climate justice session, which is great. And if you didn't get a chance, it will be posted to YouTube in the next couple of days. But that was there. I think what Maya you're speaking to hits on so many of those points that were sort of elaborated on. So thank you. So Anne, you I went back and listened to her podcast in preparation for this event, and you shared some qualitative feedback, both in this presentation and when you all were guests on the pod, that was just so relatable. I felt like, I remember when we were talking, I remember feeling like these participants in your study were saying things out loud that were just like quietly discussed in the sector, or like, and only among your like most close trusted colleagues. Like, I don't think they, which is going green and going global in this case, I don't think they necessarily contradict each other, but I can't think of a way where you can accomplish those things at the same time. Or like you mentioned in the presentation, the icky feeling. And so I'm wondering what surprised you the most about what you heard people share with you during these interviews.
Yeah, thanks, CJ. I think for me, people were very honest about the emotional side of it, as your first question alluded to, and how they really felt stuck and immobile. They weren't sure what to do. And there was kind of a crummy realization of holding both a true dedication to international education and really feeling that they had benefited so much from it, as Maya, T, and I have, and also really wanting to do more for the planet. And as we talked about in the presentation, the ways that our interviewees manage their lives in their personal space is amazing. I mean, the lists of things that they do to reduce plastic, to take public transportation, you know, it's remarkable. And then this kind of imposter syndrome that Maya mentioned in the workplace, of like feeling like they can't really have those conversations, or they don't really see the same commitment from their colleagues, or it's just something else to talk about when there's so many other things going on that are equally as important. And so I think what really surprised me was how like kind of raw and honest a lot of these conversations had, and also in real time people talked about like feeling anxious like in the conversation. So that was really was really quite surprising.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I can imagine. And you mentioned just now in your answer, like there's so many things going on, and there's people are being pulled in different directions, and there's different tensions. So I did want to ask, in terms of the tension between what in your research you say is like the ethical priorities and the financial priorities, and how like business as usual is actually quite difficult to fight against. And I think that everybody here, you know, feels that and experiences that. And I'm wondering what your interviewees did share in terms of like what they felt that they needed to start pushing back. Because you guys have shared historically sort of a few points on that. I'm wondering if you can share that with some people in terms of like what the ideas that some of them shared and sort of what you extrapolated from that.
Go ahead, Maya.
I could talk about one idea that came up a good bit, was a collaboration, at least at Middlebury, with International Environmental Policy, the department at Middlebury Institute, but extending that outside of the Institute. I think it would be pretty important to, you know, talk to the people who are making these policies, or at least people who are well versed in the environment, in those issues, because we're not speaking the same language. And I think it's important that we speak the same language at this point.
Great. Anne, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just to add on, I think it also speaks to these silos, right? We're also busy and we talk the same language with the people we know within international education, but also thinking about how to cross fields and conversations. One of the things that blew my mind from the research was, you know, a call that we in international education should be putting pressure on the airlines as like an activist, and like thinking of ourselves as long haul flyers and travelers. And of course, I never think of international education as a subset of travelers. I think of it as a subset of education. So just kind of new ways of thinking and new alliances.
Okay, I love that. And anyone I love figuring out like completely different ways of looking at it. And so I'm very grateful that you were able to like point one specific example of that. Short question with what is a very massive scope of answer, I think, is in terms of like addressing specifically, the climate anxiety in practitioners. We talked about it, but is there anything in terms of like good resources that you might be able to share with us?
Yeah, I can start, and then Maya, feel free to add. So there's actually quite a few things that have come out this past week. There's a piece in NPR and Washington Post about managing climate anxiety. So that's been helpful to me. Two things that I really like. One is, and I'll put them in the chat here. Maybe I'll introduce them and then put them in the chat so I can stay focused. One is a piece around the existential toolkit and looking at what we can do within the space of looking at this kind of existential threat and moving forward as educators. And then a second is a book called A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety by Sarah Jaquette Ray, who's at Humboldt State here in California. And really looking at like how to live and manage in this world that we now inhabit, where we do have these climate threats and this idea of living with climate change as opposed to pretending it's something outside of our daily reality, both as students and educators.
Thank you. And Maya, did you want to add to that as well?
Yeah, I don't have many resources, but I'm learning about resources through my environmental economics class I'm currently taking. And I think something that I have taken away from that class so far is learning about what's happening locally in your community regarding the environment. If there's educational efforts, and I guess you could build partnerships from there, especially with international education. That's something that's been very key, a big takeaway from that class so far.
Great, thank you. I'm still taking classes, love that. So I just wanted to go to a question that came in the chat. So if anyone else has questions, by all means, please do post them. But Amy asked, curious to know what some of the more difficult questions or topics were that your interviewees to sort of answer or address.
I'll start, and then Maya, feel free to jump in. Thanks for the question, Amy. I think one of the things that was really perplexing at that time was how practitioners should be advising students. So a lot of the questions were coming from students who were interested in international education and wanted to know, is it better to delay the opportunity or to go now? Was it better to study closer to home or further away? Should they come home for the holidays? Should the parents visit? These kinds of questions of how do you actually make responsible choices as part of programming. And in our interviews, these were like legitimate questions that people who were advising students didn't know the answer to, and also we're trying to build programs around some of these principles and weren't sure what was recommended. So I think kind of the nuts and bolts was definitely one aspect of it.
I think that goes into sort of Leanna's question as well, which is in terms of like tips for research for mobility program like Erasmus Plus to help with projects become more green. And then I love the like self-edit of perhaps this is better to be discussed during the last part of the session, which might be either getting started, but also really important to discuss with other practitioners for what that looks like. But if you had any comments sort of on that, I can sort of let that sit with you for a second because I did have another question myself. So I will come back to that one, but that one's coming for you if you have some answers. So the path forward. What might a few options be? Either Maya or Anne, yeah.
I think one of the ways forward is to work towards a few guiding principles that we as a field can agree to. They may not be perfect, but there is still, I can see lots of people smiling. I'm guessing this is not an original idea, but there is still quite a bit of a debate, at least from what I can tell, around do we decrease travel? Do we encourage a certain type of it? What do we prioritize? Is on-campus internationalization better than mobility? And it still feels very much like a debate as opposed to something that we can all get behind and a way forward. So I think we need a sophistication in how we talk about these things. As Maya noted, we need to have some more language so we can talk to the policy side, we can talk to the scientists and understand how to kind of bridge the silos, so to speak. But also, I think a plan where we can all get behind it would be a step in the right direction.
You are very right that we are all smiling. I don't know if Elsa, you wanted to pop in, but this is definitely something that's been addressed, and you and T and Maya had done a call to action video specifically around the Leaders Forum in being able to really call our leadership of the sector to sort of take that position and move forward. And Elsa, it kind of, I think it's actually pretty hilarious. I think if you want to just allude to how that is connected to what we're talking about.
Hi, yeah, sorry, I was just actually going in and amending my presentation slides so that I can show you the draft principles that we just discussed yesterday with a whole group of climate or of international education leaders at our 2 leaders forums. So I'll come back to that in a moment, but,
Perfect.
but basically, yes, that I think there is soon about to be a set of principles that people will sign up to. I'll go back to saving it now.
Yeah, so you were correctly spotting those smiles, because we're like, yes, that is very validating to hear, because I think that the work that you and the team have done is incredibly meaningful, and a lot of these leaders have a responsibility to their associations or university members, or universities are their members, and practitioners are the employees of their members, and so anxiety and climate anxiety among practitioners is something of great concern at the sort of highest levels of the sector, because it's something that people are feeling, and the practitioners are feeling, and as the associations serve members, this is part of it. So a quick last note, but I'm wondering how you hope that share how you hope to see the sector and practitioners and people here respond to your research at the highest levels, but also just people starting out in their career and international as well. So how you hope to see the research used.
Maya, do you want to go first?
Yeah, that's a big question. I'm trying to think. I mean, one of the big hopes is that I hope it doesn't get lost. I think this is very important. And of course, we're on a call with people who care about these issues. So I think that's very important. But something that has been on my mind lately is, being a graduate student about a year away from graduation, if I didn't work with Anne and T, there's a chance that we would have never talked about these issues. They would have never come up. So thinking about my cohort, they're going to be entering this market without having talked about these things. So I really hope it doesn't get lost.
Yeah.
Yeah, and my hope is maybe two-pronged. One is that I hope we acknowledge that people are having some pretty strong emotions about this, and that it's not just Gen Z, but that it's us as well, and that needs to be acknowledged and managed. It's a lot of additional emotional effort. And then also, of course, the connection to the larger issues around social justice and climate justice, that these are not separate issues, but they're all interconnected. And international education has the power to really galvanize support and understand the connections as it has before and will continue, and that it's in a unique place to really move things forward. So yeah, so we're grateful for that.
Well, we're grateful for you sharing this research and being such wonderful partners to CANIE and supporting our work and supporting the work of all the people who come to CANIE events and just are the network, if you will. And like you, Maya, I think this is really important. And what I hope is that this session continues to move that discussion forward as a real acknowledgement, and that how people are feeling about this is an important part of our work and having to process this as individuals, as teams within a department, as a department within a university, and at the bigger sector. So thank you so much for being here. I invite you to sort of engage in the chat, and if there's perhaps some thoughts for Liana, or stick around as long as you can. But yes, thank you so much. And I saw all the sort of reactions here. So I think everyone else really appreciates it as well.
Wow. Don't you hate when it's video recorded and you really want to ask a bunch of questions? Oh my goodness, that was really great. And I didn't actually get to see the whole first section live. I came in at the very end when they were answering the questions. So it was really nice to be able to bring it full circle. We're going to continue. We're actually on time. This is a miracle, I feel like sometimes. We're going to continue with part 2 of this session 2, which is going to focus on getting started. And Elsa Lamont's going to come in and give us some of her special sauce, I like to say, and get us started in thinking about it. And we'll follow up with a panel of wonderful people who I will introduce after Elsa's presentation. So Elsa, would you like to take the reins?
I would. Thank you very much for handing them over, Ine. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's great to be here. I have now heard that presentation from Anne and Maya and T 2 or 3 times if you count the pod. And every time I get so much more out of it. And it's really great, I think, and really helpful for all of us, and healthy that we're having that conversation about what climate change might actually mean for us personally and emotionally. And certainly I find that the way that I deal with any climate anxiety is by taking some action. So how do you get started with climate action in international education? And just so that people know, my background is I worked in 3 different Australian universities for 16 years in a variety of different roles, from an international recruitment person on the road to eventually international Pro-Vice Chancellor International. So I've had a variety of different roles, and I've been responsible for learning abroad, student recruitment, and transnational at different times. So hopefully I can bring that diverse experience to bear on this topic in a useful way. So what we're going to do quite quickly is just have a quick look at how climate change and international education intersect, and give you a kind of framework to approach it, and some really practical tools and examples. The last session brought in the principles. They're very much in their draft state at the moment. So these are the easy principles, and there's a real pun here, a real bad dad joke here. They're the easy principles, but they're actually hard to implement. But I think one of the core parts of this, which is so important, and it goes to number 1 there, is that this is our responsibility. It is part of what we have to do as international educators. And so having the discussion and getting people to kind of accept that this is part of the role, it's kind of like global citizenship plus, I would say. That's That's the draft principle number one. The second one is that we have to take action, and it has to include emissions reductions. And the third is that we need to try and pull a whole range of different levers. So we must take a holistic approach. It's not just emissions reduction, it's not just climate literacy, it's a whole heap of different approaches, and that we must do so in a way that still supports climate justice. So somebody asked in the chat, these are very draft principles. The idea is that we will include them in what we're calling the CANIE COP26 Glasgow Protocol, which will be basically a statement that international educators can sign up to, which will include these principles and then a range of different actions that people can commit to. And certainly from our leaders forums this week, there was a real sense that people are ready to sign up to something. And in fact, that these principles do not go nearly far enough and do not show enough ambition. So we will be thinking about ways to wordsmith these, and that keep an eye on this and follow CANIE for more information. So back to this session. We're going to also look at student attitudes, which I think is an incredibly important part of this, share some popular approaches to taking climate action in international ed, and giving you some key action points. So first of all, where are we as international educators contributing to the problem? And it is obviously in our role in generating greenhouse gas emissions. Those emissions that we're pumping into the atmosphere are causing temperatures to rise. There's absolutely no doubt about that. The science is really clear, and the latest IPCC report sounded a code red for humanity. This is why we can't just rely on climate education, on building the climate literacy of students and waiting for them to graduate and then get into jobs where they will take a different approach 10, 15, 20 years down the line. This decade is absolutely critical if we are to have any chance at all of keeping global temperature rise within that 1.5 degree Celsius, which the Paris Agreement is holding us to. And in fact, it's really the next year or two that are the most critical. So every action we can take, every degree counts, every fraction of a degree counts, and it will minimize the harm caused by global heating. So let's look a little bit about what we know about how these two things intersect and where our carbon footprint comes from as a sector. It's definitely from international student travel, and anyone who's been to any CANIE events previously knows that we are all here because we're passionate about the power of international education to transform lives. I'm certainly somebody for whom that is true. And we're not about trying to remove those benefits from people. It's about how we do this more intentionally, more sensitively, how we actually reorganize the business of international education behind the scenes, probably more so even than how we organize the student travel. Staff and faculty travel, brochure production and shipping, events and catering, all the supply chain. What we don't look at is the institutional emissions because those tend to be covered. But a really important point is that we should not try and do this separately from institutional or organizational approaches to sustainability. The power, I think, comes in teaming up with the others within our organizations and trying to get rid of some of those silos and work together. Now, Professor Robin Shields at the University of Bristol, who is a friend of CANIE, did some really groundbreaking research a couple of years ago, the first that certainly I'd seen, that calculated the greenhouse gas emissions associated with degree-seeking students internationally. And he put that at basically this is just looking at their aviation emissions. And he calculated that at between 14 and 39 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's the equivalent of a small country like Croatia or Tunisia, depending which end of the scale. Now, imagine if one of those countries had decided not to go to the COP talks in Glasgow and was saying, we're not going to do anything. Well, our sector, just in its degree-seeking students, is essentially the equivalent of a country, and we need to do our part as well. So this is something that I think is really important. It's a bit dry, but bear with me. So carbon accounting very often focuses on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Scope 3 is the kind of indirect emissions associated with the university, for example. I'm most used to universities, so apologies to those who are in other kinds of institutions for my shorthand. If a university counts its own emissions from its energy use and from its core kind of business, generally it doesn't count those emissions down the supply chain stream. And that's often, for our line of work, that is where the action is happening. So it's the international students. Sure, they have to travel to come to the university to get their qualification, or they have to travel to a partner to get their study abroad experience. And also the business travel that we as international educators do comes under that category. Even some universities that have carbon neutral certification don't count scope 3. So I think it's really useful to go back and talk to your institution and ask that question, are you counting this as part of your overall targets and strategies? And if not, then why not? It really should be in there. So what we're going to do now is just ask you to share with us what you know about emissions from associated with your work. And I can see that the poll has already been launched. So that's great, it's up there. Can everybody see the poll? No, okay. We'll try it again. Let's see, here we go. Okay, is that better? Can people see the poll? Excellent. All right, so let's see how many of you know about the emissions associated with your area of work, whether that's your student travel or business travel or the whole of your organization. I won't share with you yet what the results were from this earlier session today. It'd be interesting to see if there's any changes, whether you lot are more aware. My guess is that you might be, but let's see. Okay, so we've got about 2/3 of you have already answered. We'll give you just a few seconds more before we stop the poll. Okay, I think we'll just end that there. We've got, okay, now there's more answers coming in. 2 more seconds. Okay, so let's have a look at the results. Can everyone see those results? Wonderful. Okay, the tech worked better here. And it looks like you do have a better understanding in this cohort than your colleagues from some other parts of the world earlier, where only, I think it was 75% at the earlier session who said they didn't know the emissions associated with any part of their program. But still, the fact that 61% of you don't know that is, I think, this is not to lay blame anywhere. I think it's but a real eye-opener that most people here working in organizations that are generally very data driven don't have any data on that. Okay, let's move on. And, you know, people say, why the focus on flying? But really, this is where our emissions come from. This is where our carbon footprint is. And, you know, sure, events like this also generate some emissions, but it is a tiny, tiny fraction. You know, it's thousands-fold more when you look at actual physical travel. So it's an uncomfortable, inconvenient truth, but it's a truth nonetheless. So when you look at one part of how we approach this has to be around looking for more sustainable approaches, lower carbon approaches to travel. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Next, student attitudes. So we know student attitudes are changing, not just students, but young people generally. I want to share this really quite interesting research that was done earlier this year, perhaps this year? Yes, COVID time, can't remember, was this year. Looking at prospective international students, so degree-seeking students. Most of these students were in India and other parts of Asia and looking to go to English-speaking destinations. And they were asked what factors were most important governing their choice of where to go and study. And you could look at this chart and say, well, you know, only 9% cited a university's reputation for sustainability as being the primary deciding factor. But another way to look at this is that there's 9% of students who chose their institution on that basis when there isn't actually that much information out there about what universities are doing. There is the Times Higher Education Impact Ranking, but it's probably not front of mind for every prospective student out there yet. It's not part of how most universities present themselves, and yet 9% of students chose that as their main deciding factor. And on where another really interesting perspective here, I think, is that 9% is the same number as those students who cited graduate employability prospects as their main reason. Now, look how much weight and how much effort universities invest in graduate employability. And also the 9% is 1% more than the location of the university. So I think this is an early indication that people should really be paying attention to this for the bottom line as well as for all the other reasons. Okay, now the most important part. So what do we do about it? Well, the first part, the most important part, is to do what we can to reduce emissions. So start by eliminating anything that is not necessary. And what the pandemic experience has taught us is that there's so much of our work that we can actually do to organize the field of international education without physical travel. I'm not saying we shouldn't ever travel again, but I heard this week, for example, the British Council say that they have a target to cut 50% of their business travel. And, you know, that's something that I think a lot of us are going to have to accept or certainly consider. So finding ways to cut out unnecessary emissions and then tracking, reducing the rest. The whole insetting, offsetting conversation, I'm going to park, we might come back to it, but the main thing is to get those emissions down in the first place. Obviously, we're in the business of education, educating others, both staff, students, our communities, that's all incredibly important too, as is using the power of our fields to influence and to advocate for change at policy level, but within our organizations as well, and being mindful of where we spend our money. Here are some of the examples of how a lot of institutions are approaching this. Many have brought in more sustainable travel policies, definitely incentivizing lower carbon means of travel, essentially trains over planes, but that works better in some parts than others. Many are looking at even sharing information about the climate credentials of prospective university partners, study destinations, as well as including in their kind of study partner dashboards information about the emissions associated with reaching that destination. Many organizations are also building in climate literacy to their pre-departures, their inductions. The University of Bath has recently made that a mandatory part of their induction for all students, which is, I think, about 5,000. So it's a pretty ambitious program. Well done to them. And many organizations, UMAP, for example, shared with us this week at the Leaders Forum that they've been increasing the proportion of virtual exchange relative to in-person exchange as one of the ways that they are approaching this issue. And of course, that just shifting that percentage of what's in virtual versus in real life is going to be a part of any effective solution. Now, for those of you who would like some student-facing resources, and I think we have links to both of these on the CANIE website, I thoroughly recommend the CIS Australia book, partly because I developed it with them, but it's a really great resource. It's free, it's available on their website, check it out. And the UCD Green Guide is another great resource. So, key action points. What can you do today? I saw earlier that Sebastian from FPP was here. Hello, I think it was you, Sebastian, that made a really great point at the Leaders Forum this week. If people say they don't have the time and the resources and the staffing to tackle an issue, that's because they haven't given it any priority. There was a really fantastic counterexample to that, which was from Universities UK International, who said it wasn't in our strategy, so we found it really hard to tackle this properly. So we changed our strategy. We made a new strategy, and then we made it somebody's job. And as soon as we had put it into somebody's job, we could allocate funds to it. We could allocate targets to it. We could build it into the core work of our organization. And I think that's such an important part of how we should approach this. The next step is obviously, again, if something doesn't get measured, often it doesn't get any priority. So start looking at what you can measure, talking to the sustainability office, if you have one, talking to your colleagues about what you already know, and making sure that international education is part of that picture. I loved Adrian from CANIE there also shared earlier that in her work at San Diego State University, she basically just went from the international office, went and injected herself into all of these institutional committees on sustainability. She didn't ask permission, she just went, and I think that is a fantastic approach. So talking about it, letting people know in your organization that you're interested, that can be a really useful start. You need a coalition to attack this. You need to build a consensus for action. And that last point is simply, just get started. I think so many people are scared. They don't know exactly what to do. It's like, how do we do this? There will be ways that perhaps you could lend your weight to that are already happening. So that my message is just go for it, and we are here and we will help you as much as we possibly can. So that's all from me. And now I know I will hand back to our wonderful host, Ine.
Thank you so much, Elsa. I love that you left us with some ways to get started, because that's how we're going to end after the Q&A moderation too, with 3 additional people giving us some pointers. So without further ado, I would like to make sure that we have time to give them a chance to just say what they would like. We're going to introduce Chris Haynes, the Assistant Director of Student Services to Education Broad Office at the University of South Florida. If you all have been paying attention, Florida needs some help. Daniel Ponce-Taylor, Director of Operations and International Partnerships at IOI, Intercultural Outreach Initiative, and he's also the chair of the NAFSA Sustainability SIG. So if you didn't know about that, now you know. Get involved, join that. Utyo Raichaudhuri is the Vice Provost of the University of Denver, and he's coming here today with us again. He's closest to me, being right here in Arizona. I'm gonna get started and ask some questions. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. I'm really excited to talk to all three of you, and I'm sure that everyone's gonna have a great time hearing what you have to share today. The first question I have for you all today is just a question I'd like to see if all of you could provide some input on. It's really about what was your catalyst or turning point for you to get started with addressing the climate crisis. And I'm gonna just add a comment really quickly, because I noticed in the chat, there were a lot of people saying that, if they wanted to get started, it was literally an extra layer of responsibility onto the job they already had. So if at any point you can address some of that too, how do you balance it out if it's not already part of your strategy? That'd be wonderful. But what was the catalyst or turning point for you in getting started with addressing the climate crisis? I'm going to go ahead and start with Utyo today.
Good morning, everyone from Denver or wherever in the world you are. Welcome. So I started my career as an architect. So I started out with an idea that maybe I'm on the right side to be responsive and caring, but soon realized that client opulence, greed did not really care. Style statements were probably not aligned with everything that we were doing. And so I started exploring more sustainable ways of sourcing material, better designed homes, reduced heat loads, just the capacity to live responsibly. So my work was at that time, 25, 30 years ago, we used to call them intelligent design, what we now know as green design or architecture. My work in higher ed was mostly focused on environmental justice, and my doctorate is in sustainable development. So I've continued to do that work. And as I've been involved with international education over the last 20 years, those are the areas that I've really focused on. And now a lot of my work and my primary goal is integrating the work of global learning to reflect the goals of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and then overlay with how Industry 4.0 intersects with them in the work. It has led on, understanding student needs, creating pro-environmental behaviors for them, award-winning programs based on that, which are grounded on the new environment paradigm, looking at participant behavior, attitude, the skills that we are giving them to shape the work that they're doing. And, statistically, we are seeing in the research that programs that are providing those opportunities are really making a difference, and students are emerging out of those programs at the end with a lot more understanding, and it is really shifting who they are. So right, even today, I mean, out of the pandemic, our focus is, give people a time with empathy to have maybe flex work environments, respond to their needs. They're saving gas to drive to work. We can use technology to connect, We need to look into the eyes of our faculty, of our staff, of our students. As parents, we need to look into the eyes of our kids and tell them that we are making a choice that will protect their future. For a fraction of the cost we pay for, flood insurance for our houses, we can, begin forestation efforts. We can do things that will protect the future. And I tell you, vote to elect leaders who are pro-environmental in their approach and believe in the work that they're saying. They'll save you, me, and our planet.
Thank you. I feel sometimes a little bit frustrated that we have to almost, at least in my opinion, feels like beg people to care about humanity, beg people to be empathetic, but I don't know what it takes to get there. So this is the small steps that we're taking within our field. Daniel, I'm going to go ahead and pose that same question to you.
So I was on mute. So I guess my initial research background was on coral reef research. So very early on, I started seeing drastic changes from when I started studying to, in short amount of time, I saw changes in the reefs that I was studying in the coastal side of Mexico, in the Caribbean coast of Mexico. So that's where really I started thinking, okay, well, this is an issue in the research subject that I work on. Then I guess when I kind of transitioned to international education, I remember going to one of my first NAFSA conferences, and to me it was a bit of a shock because I was kind of seeing this huge kind of transatlantic boat moving around, and me coming from this kind of marine biology, coral reef conservation side of things, and running operations, running kind of conservation programs. No one was really talking about sustainability. No one was really talking about climate change. Everyone's talking about budget and numbers and how many groups can I hurt that. And I was a little bit kind of shocked. So then what I did about it, I said, okay, I cannot actually be in this field if sustainability is not part of what I do. So what I started doing is I started joining different working groups, the sustainability special interest group and other groups. And what we did is when I started kind of collaborating with IOI, it's kind of like we started in all our conversations putting sustainability in the core of the conversation. Any partners that wanted to work with us, okay, sustainability had to be in the forefront of our conversations. It doesn't mean that we weren't talking to those who didn't have a sustainability strategy, but we made sure that if they wanted to collaborate with us, then sustainability was going to be a part of the conversation. And to those comments before, that if it's not, if it's an extra kind of thing, therefore it makes it easier. Sure, if we have it in the conversation and we have it in the budgets from the word go, then it's much easier to actually ensure that it happens. And in my organization at IOI, IOI is actually a sustainability focused organization. It's not a study abroad organization. Study abroad is just an add-on to be able to fund the sustainability work that we do. So for us, it's very easy. For me, it's we don't have an issue with allocating resources or budget because it's what we do. We work in sustainability and we use study abroad as a way to fund those sustainability projects. So I guess I'm very lucky that I don't have to kind of fiddle around and find budgets or time. It's what we do. But I think it's very important, the comments that we made before, that unless it's an institutional culture approach and shift, it's going to be very hard. So yeah, I mean, I guess that NAFSA experience for me was just like, okay, and something needs to change here.
Definitely. I was a molecular cellular developmental biologist before all this field, so I feel your pain of transitioning. Chris, I want to ask you, and I know that you were in an office at an institution working with students daily and trying to work out all the different layers of that. So where are you with this catalyst at this point? Where are you in your journey?
Yeah. And, thanks for the question. And I think for me, it was kind of the realization I wanted to stay in this field. I was like, okay, I want to do good things in the field of international education. How do we keep this around? And I'm very lucky to kind of oversee a lot of all of our advising. And I think it's already been kind of mentioned a few times in this presentation, but just kind of honing that student voice and listening to students kind of pushed me to inquire about what are we doing in terms of sustainability? How are we developing programs? How are we meeting, even though it was a small portion, how are we meeting the student demand here? And that really got me, kind of looking and searching, kind of like to Daniel's point, going to NASA and Forum and some of these other events or other conferences and not really hearing much about it. So that pushed me I ended up getting a master's in global sustainability. We very lucky to share a same floor as that unit on our campus. So I was like, okay, I'll go across the hall and see what that's all about. So having that access, but then also trying to find those bridges, where we can implement strategies from a holistic perspective, was really eye-opening, and you run into a lot of walls. And so I think that's something that, I'm really thankful for CANIE providing these opportunities to discuss action items and how we can get involved and how we can push things forward and move that needle. So I think that was me.
Thank you. Wow, I think that's going to be a common theme, and I hope that in your journey of networking with all the folks here and meeting different people that you're on the panel with today, for example, that you'll find some partners that are maybe not just always next door, but in our very global group that we have. So there's always someone who's done something. Utu, I'm going to come back to you, and I'm going to ask you a question that's connected back to being at an institution. So, you know, we're just talking about trying to do all this, and it seems like you're sometimes trying to hit a wall or you're doing it alone. So climate action requires collaboration and partnership. What are some challenges of finding international education allies in an institution?
Thanks for the question, Ine. I think our first challenge is our own intentionality to seek out allies and how do we prioritize this? You know, there's one thing to talk about it, and then second is to actually go about and do it. But we need help. We need support, bottom up and top down. I'm thankful. I'm at a university where, you know, our chancellor got inaugurated last month. And one of the priority things that he announced at his inauguration is that we as a university are going to be carbon neutral by 2030. And this is us, part of the coalition of universities that were there. And we are moving the goalpost closer from 2050 to 2030. And that is the kind of commitment that universities need to make. We need to go tell other people, other institutions, we can do this. And maybe one day go from carbon neutral to carbon negative. This is what is required. And we need the top decision makers, you know, to bring in these commitments. We've already lowered our target was to lower carbon emissions by about 24% by last year. Partly due to the pandemic and other things, we are at 28% today. But these require sustained education campaigns. We have on-campus electric vehicle charging stations, free access to public transportation to everybody in the DU community in a city like Denver, where there isn't a whole lot of public transport opportunities, to encourage them. Take the light rail, take the bus. And then we are now providing, you know, shuttle programs, you know, electric shuttles running to close the last mile gap so that, you know, if you're commuting, you can still get to your place. So, you know, carbon neutrality is not only just a focus about protecting the environment, it is also living up to what we are as a university, you know, say for Denver, it is, you know, as an anchor institution in the community, as a university for the public good. These are the things that we need to focus on. But today, you know, we see so much work in international education, which due to the pandemic has really been, you know, energized. You know, you see collaborative online international learning work, virtual exchange work, you know, virtual research, augmented realities, virtual research labs. You know, all of these are continuing the benefits of experiencing experiential education opportunities through different modalities, and we need to encourage and provide those opportunities. You know, develop coursework modules. Universities today, many of them have, or probably numerous have, you know, minors, majors, which are connected to the field of sustainability. International education needs to bring those faculty, those students together, need to connect with those folks on campus so that that work is, you know, in sync. People still feel like being pro-environmental means to just be able to recycle, but the need is much greater today. And, you know, we need action in every facet that we are doing.
I think what you're illustrating just shows that if you do have someone at the top really supporting it and making it a priority, there's a lot of things you can end up doing with that. So that's a great example for us to, you know, aspire to get to, but also to a lot of the points that have been made, not always wait for it. Jump in and make it happen. Be intentional about it, be purposeful, and try to get your foot in the door whatever way you can, because people aren't always going to be there waiting for you to, you know, knock at the door. All right, well, Daniel, I would like to ask you the next question. What was the turning point to gaining and keeping momentum? So you went through this catalyst, you figured out that you were going to get into this, but how do you keep going, especially if you're maybe new to the field and people aren't kind of at the same level as you yet? How do we actually persist and keep people on board once you gain that initial catalyst?
Yeah, so I mean, it's difficult, as we said, especially if you're the only one within an institution. And I'd like to point out before that, I mentioned NASA, but like the interesting thing was that when I was talking to people, maybe it wasn't the first thing that people would mention, but when sustainability came on board or in the conversation, most people were super interested about it. So it was this kind of like, okay, it's not what people talk about, but when you mention it, they're like, oh yeah, actually, this is something important. So it was interesting. But yeah. As I said, if it's not in your day-to-day role, if you're by yourself, then it is hard. I guess like if you're able to surround yourself with people, whether it's in your institution, in other departments, in other schools, or in your neighborhood, locally, that's really gonna help. Like in my case, working within a team and an NGO that really has sustainability in its core and its DNA, and we use sustainability to drive most of our decisions. Then I think it really, as I said before, it helped me realize that it doesn't have to be an extra. In fact, it shouldn't be an extra. So I guess if you can do that, if you can just surround yourself by others that know about this topic, and just you can just start by osmosis, start learning and gaining as much information as possible. That's really going to help. So try to change that organizational culture. Start small within your team. I think that's going to be a big one. And that way, it'll start. If you change that organizational culture, it helps you realize that climate-related actions are possible. Then you're going to start making decisions to make big actions. In our case, it was when we realized that we need to go a step further, and we kind of decided that it was time to develop and implement the carbon negative strategy, which hopefully will be completed by next year. But to be honest, also kind of seeing so many in talking about carbon strategy now, CANIE being born, this really helps the momentum. Like having other people to be able to, other forums to be able to talk about this topic, realize that you're not by yourself, and you're just not thinking crazy ideas and crazy kind of strategies. And you're like, well, I should be talking about budgets only in numbers. And no, so I think that really helps. So that I appreciate the opportunity that we have in different forums. Obviously, CANIE not being the only one, CANIE focus around climate actions, I think is great. And maybe the other one is kind of like, the other one just comes to mind, is kind of like now that we hopefully going past COVID times. But I think during COVID, a lot of people kind of saw that, and many people saw that nature can actually regenerate if human presence is reduced or minimized. And then kind of like in our case, if you bring that to our field, I think it's good to start thinking how we can continue providing this amazing transformational experiences, but not having the negative impacts that we sometimes have on environmental local communities, wherever it may be. So not only leave them as they are, so not just thinking sustainably, but think more from a regenerative manner. And I know there was a great podcast a couple of weeks ago that I highly recommend that you guys had on regenerative thinking. But again, talking about how this helps, because I wrote a blog on NASA about regenerative study abroad, and then Jenny Lee from she was at the podcast contacted me and said, hey, have you read my article? And it was basically talking about the same thing. So again, having these networks and this opportunities to think actually other people are thinking along the same lines makes you kind of really think on bigger terms. So yeah, I think definitely surround yourself within your team, within your schools, within your local environment, with people thinking the same way. So it really makes a big difference.
And now within CANIE too, so we can be part of your family. Everybody, if you need a family, find CANIE. Okay, CANIE can. Chris, following the letter C, I want to ask you a little bit about what are your hopes for dramatic change, because we've been hearing about a campus where you have a lot of support, just kind of getting started and starting to thrive by creating a mini network and then seeing that expand? What are your hopes? Florida needs you, Chris. What are your hopes? Where are we gonna get here?
Yeah. So I get the moonshot question, right? Like, where are we going with all of this? And it's tough, but I'm very hopeful. And conferences like this, summits like this are really inspiring. But I really hope just the field embraces, the situation we're in. And takes advantage of the challenge that lies ahead and challenges some of the status quo. I think COVID is kind of helping us realize that we can adapt and change and do things differently. And I think it's one of the things too, where hopefully I think kind of numbers and rankings kind of rule the day, at least, from the institutional level sometimes. And I hope we can kind of get back to some of the quality as well. Because I think that's where some of the major impacts can be found, especially on students. We want to expose them to these wonderful opportunities, but if we can guide them and educate them, from pre-departure through the experience itself and even into the reentry aspects, that's where we can multiply and really expand our impacts and having more responsible travelers. So I think that's the other hope, is that we beat students to the punch, right? I think it's kind of been talked about a little bit earlier in meeting student demand, but if we can get there first and let students know that we're developing these programs, in a sustainable way, and this is how responsible travel works, hopefully they can take that above and beyond into the future. So, I'm hopeful for the field. I'm hopeful for the future, and hopefully, we can continue moving the needle forward and keep challenging the status quo and make some positive change.
Great, thank you. I'm just gonna have you each just give everyone one action that someone could start doing today to move their international office, their department, their organization forward. One tip, and if you have more, you can share them in the breakout networking session. Chris, I'll go ahead and start with you since you wrapped.
I'll dive in. I think, taking action is the biggest part. I think one of the things that we're doing, we're starting from a bottom-up perspective. I know a top-down perspective, it works as well, and I've seen a lot of discussions in the chat, but having some pushback and different priorities, we didn't want to stay inactive. So we kind of challenged ourselves in my little office to create a carbon neutral office and really analyze how we're doing outreach and recruitment. We have 75 faculty-led programs. We don't need flyers for all of those. So starting little, and then the one thing that we found is when we started to implement some of these smaller changes, we'd get some pushback from faculty, like, where are my flyers? Where are my posters? And that opened up a good dialogue. And we can start talking about why it's important that, you don't need these. We have students here. We have students in a virtual setting now. So just taking these small steps can actually, expand the conversation and really get others that you didn't really intentionally get involved. So yeah, any small step is powerful. So go ahead and take it and know that you have a supportive group like CANIE, Forum for Education Abroad, all sorts of other people out there doing these great things as well.
Thank you. Daniel, what about you? Do you have something for us to take with us?
Yeah, I agree that doing something is better than nothing. So doing nothing is actually not an option nowadays, especially with the situation we are. So that's something definitely to do. And I said before, just look internally for allies and expertise within your organization, your network, locally. There's so much happening out there, and so many kind of good resources, good best practices. So just let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's just because by reinventing the wheel, we're just avoiding just moving faster. We need to be bold and radical, think big, I think, and sometimes kind of like, instead of just trying to think, all these kind of large strategies, as Chris was just saying, look inwards, into your own operations, start reducing the impact rather than just looking outwards, more complex initiatives. If you can, fantastic. But finally, I just going back to that regenerative concept, I think, I encourage everyone to think a bit more about that regenerative mindset, because I feel I think we're in an amazing position not only to just leave things as they are, but actually live them better, be drivers for positive regeneration. And in our case, we were lucky to have a sustainable regenerative agriculture project that's allowing our carbon negative strategy to happen. But there are many ways to think about this kind of regenerative approach rather than just sustainability. So we need to be bold. We need to be really kind of, as Elsa said, the next couple of years are very important. So I think we need to think along those lines.
Thank you. Utio, I have a feeling that to kind of play off of Daniel's words, you're going to leave us with something that leaves us better, leaves us at a better place. So would you like to share an action for us?
Yeah, the key thing for us is, again, we have to do it, and we have to encourage everyone else to do it along with us. We ask ourselves, does your education abroad program have learning goals that are aligned with sustainable development goals? If not, help people make that alignment, create that tangible connection. It is all an impact of behaviors, actions, and that attitude that we can put in there. I mean, we have all been ravaged by this pandemic, right? I think this is the time to now think about contagious kindness. And this is our kindness towards our planet. And that is the least that we can do. The climate crisis strain is not leaving, it has left. We have to run fast so we can probably jump onto the caboose and do something about it. I get yourself to take action and hold yourself accountable. And that is the first thing we can do. Ask yourself every day, what have we done today that is, contributing to that?
Thank you all. I'm gonna give you one action too, because why not, right? I'm gonna give you an action of go to one of the regional meetings during the CANIE Climate Action Week, because not only is it going to be a great way to meet other people that can be part of the group that Daniel said you need to get together with and help you learn about ways to be starting small, like Chris said, but they might be able to do what Utio said, be your accountability partners and bring it all together. And then on top of it, there was a leadership forum during this week that happened earlier. And there's going to be announcements about what a lot of the leaders in our field have said that they're going to commit to. And if they're driving some of these commitments, there's a potential for our industry to make a big change. So you don't want to miss that. All right, y'all, it is time for us to stop talking to you at like these heads and get you in a smaller room for a little while. We have about 20 minutes, which is really great for like normal times. So let's jump into the breakout rooms and let's get started talking to one another.